They are still alive. You might still talk to them. They might still call on your birthday, still show up at the same gatherings, still send the occasional message that lands in your life like a reminder that they exist and you exist, and there is some version of a relationship still technically happening between you. They have not died. They have not left in any of the ways that would give you permission to grieve them. And yet, something between you is gone. Something that mattered, something that was real, something you built or grew up inside or depended on in ways you did not fully understand until it was no longer available to you. And here is the thing nobody tells you about this particular kind of loss. There is no funeral for it. There is no moment where the people around you pause and acknowledge what happened. There is no language in the ordinary vocabulary of grief that covers what you are carrying. Because the person is still here, and when the person is still here, the loss is invisible, even to you, even to yourself. You are grieving something nobody will confirm is worth grieving, because from the outside, nothing looks like it has ended. But you know differently. You know that the version of them you needed, the one who was present in the specific ways that mattered to you, the one who knew you in the particular way that made you feel known, that version is gone. And the person who remains, whoever they are now, whoever they have become, whoever they have always been beneath the version you constructed, they are not the same person. Or perhaps you were not the same person. Or perhaps you both grew in directions that took you too far apart to reach each other anymore. Whatever the reason, something real has ended, and you are carrying the loss of it in a body that has no word for what it is carrying. This is the psychology of grieving relationships that are still alive, and it is one of the most silent forms of grief a person can carry, because the world does not give you permission to grieve what you have not lost, and so you carry it alone and unnamed, for years sometimes, long past the point where the naming might have helped. Psychologists call it ambiguous loss. It is the grief that has no clear endpoint, no confirmed absence, no socially sanctioned mourning period. The term was developed to describe situations where a person is physically present but psychologically absent. The parent with dementia who is there but not there. The partner whose depression has made them unreachable. The family member whose addiction has taken away the person you knew while leaving their body behind. But the concept extends beyond those clinical definitions. It extends to every relationship where the version of the person you needed has become unavailable, without anyone dying, without anyone formally leaving, without any event dramatic enough to justify the weight of what you are feeling. It is the parent who was emotionally present when you were small and became progressively less available as you got older, as their own difficulties closed in, as their attention turned elsewhere, as life made them into a smaller version of who they had been. And you grieve the parent you had then. You grieve access to something that was real and that ended without announcement. You grieve the loss of being known by someone who once knew you, who has now stopped asking the questions that would allow them to continue knowing you. And you cannot quite say to anyone, "My parent is still alive, but I am grieving them," because the sentence sounds wrong, because people will tell you to be grateful they are still here, because the grief feels like ingratitude, and the ingratitude feels like a flaw. It is the friendship that faded so gradually that you cannot identify the moment it ended. The friend you were closest to in one chapter of your life, who moved into a different chapter so thoroughly that the person you are now and the person they are now have almost nothing in common with the people who were inseparable once. And you miss them, not the person they are now. You barely know that person. You miss the person they were when they were your person. You miss the specific quality of being known by them in that specific time. And that person is gone, even though they have your phone number and would probably pick up if you called. It is the relationship that changed when something happened, a betrayal, a disappointment, a revelation, and never quite recovered. Where trust was damaged in a way that did not break the relationship entirely, but altered it permanently. Where you are still together in some sense, but something is different now. Something is missing. Something that was once possible between you is no longer possible. And you are supposed to move on from that because the relationship is still there. But what is there is not the same thing that was there before. And what was there before is what you are grieving. And nobody told you you were allowed to do that. Ambiguous loss is grief without closure. Grief without an ending that the world can see and confirm. Grief that has to be carried alongside a relationship that is still technically ongoing, which means you are simultaneously losing something and maintaining the container it came from, which is one of the most emotionally complex things a human being can be asked to do. The reason this grief stays silent is that it has no socially accepted form. When someone dies, grief is expected and accommodated. When a relationship ends dramatically, divorce, estrangement, a falling out, grief is acknowledged even if it is uncomfortable. But when a relationship simply changes, fades, shifts into something lesser, when you lose not the person, but the version of the person that mattered, there is no script for that. There is no occasion on which you are given the floor to say that something real has ended. There is only the ongoing obligation to treat the remaining shell of the relationship as if it were the same thing it used to be. And so you perform it. You show up to the gatherings, you make the phone calls, you exchange the messages. You participate in the maintenance of a relationship whose original content has been replaced with something smaller and more formal and far less nourishing. And nobody around you knows that the maintenance is costing you something, that every interaction with this person is a reminder of what used to be possible between you and is not anymore, that the presence of them in your life is not comforting, but is instead a kind of ongoing low-level grief that has no permission to resolve. There is also a particular kind of guilt that comes with this grief, because to grieve someone who is still alive, to mourn the loss of a relationship that is still technically present, feels like a judgment, like you are saying this person is not enough, like you are saying what they are now is insufficient compared to what they were. And there is no way to make that feeling comfortable because it contains a truth that is uncomfortable, that people change, that relationships change, that the thing you needed from someone is no longer available, even though they are still there. And underneath the guilt, there is often anger, a quiet, unresolvable anger at the person for changing, for not being who they were, for not being able to give you now what they gave you then. An anger that has nowhere to go because you cannot be angry at someone for growing older or becoming more limited or falling short of a version of themselves that may no longer exist. And so the anger turns inward, becomes confusion, becomes the low-grade melancholy of someone who is grieving something they cannot name to anyone in their life. The first cost is the ongoing energy of maintaining a relationship that no longer nourishes you. Every interaction with this person, every gathering attended, every call made, every message exchanged requires a particular kind of emotional management. You have to hold the grief aside in order to function in the relationship. You have to present as someone who is fine with things as they are, while carrying the knowledge of how things were. That management is invisible and continuous and quietly exhausting in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who is not doing it. The second cost is the displacement of the grief, because the grief has nowhere to go, no ceremony, no acknowledged ending, no permission to resolve. It goes somewhere else. It shows up as a vague, sourceless sadness on occasions that should be happy. It shows up as a particular quality of loneliness in the middle of time spent with them, the loneliness of being with someone you once knew fully and who now knows a much smaller version of you. The grief goes underground and it comes out sideways and it colors things it was not meant to color. The third cost is what it does to your ability to be present in other relationships. When you are carrying unacknowledged grief, it creates a kind of emotional crowding. There is less space for the new things, less capacity for the relationships that are actually available to you. The unprocessed loss takes up room that might otherwise be available for the connections that are still whole, still nourishing, still capable of giving you what the faded relationship used to give you. The grief goes underground, and it comes out sideways, and it colors things it was not meant to color. The most honest cost of ambiguous loss is this. It keeps you attached to an absence, not to the person, to the version of the person that is no longer there. And that attachment, however understandable, however earned, is a loyalty to something that cannot receive it, a reaching towards something that is not there to be reached anymore. And the energy spent in that reaching is energy that cannot go toward what is. Think about the person, the specific one this is about for you, and think about what you are still carrying from them. Not the relationship as it is now, but the version of it that you lost. The specific quality of being known by them that is no longer available. The conversations that used to be possible. The version of you that existed in relationship to the version of them that existed. What do you miss? Not in general, specifically. What would you give to have back for one afternoon the relationship as it was at its best? Now think about how long you have been carrying that missing. Not actively, not with your full attention, just as background weight. A presence at the edge of your awareness in situations where that relationship is invoked. At the gatherings, in the conversations, in the moments where you catch yourself performing a connection that stopped being real some time ago. And ask yourself whether you have ever named it, not to anyone else, to yourself. Have you ever said clearly, honestly, without softening it, this relationship is not what it was, and I am grieving the version of it that is gone? Have you given yourself permission to feel the full weight of that? Or have you been carrying it in the way you carry most things, quietly, efficiently, without making anyone uncomfortable, without making yourself uncomfortable, managing it until it becomes simply part of the background of your life? Because the naming matters. Not to resolve the grief. Nothing resolves ambiguous loss completely, because there is no ending to resolve it around, but to give it the weight it deserves. To acknowledge that something real was lost, even if it was not lost in the ways the world recognizes. To stop asking the grief to be small, because the loss is not officially large. To let it be what it is, a genuine, legitimate, significant loss, and to give yourself the permission to feel it that nobody else is going to give you. You are allowed to grieve this. That is the most important thing this episode can say. You are allowed to grieve a relationship that is still alive. You are allowed to mourn the version of a person that you no longer have access to. You are allowed to feel the loss of what used to be possible between you and is not anymore. You do not need that person to have died. You do not need the relationship to have ended in any visible way. You do not need anyone else to confirm that what you are carrying is real. It is real. It has been real. And you have been carrying it alone because you did not know you had permission to put it down anywhere. Grieving does not mean giving up on the relationship. It does not mean deciding that the person is not worth the effort. It does not mean turning away from what remains. It means acknowledging that what remains is different from what was. That you can love someone and simultaneously mourn the version of them that is no longer available to you. That you can maintain a relationship and also grieve the fuller version of it that once existed. Both things are possible. Both things are true. And holding both of them, rather than collapsing one into the other, is what allows you to be honest about the grief without it destroying what is left. There is also the possibility, not always, not in every case, but sometimes, that the relationship is not beyond repair, that the distance between who you both are now is real but bridgeable, that the conversation that would move things is available if someone is willing to begin it, that the version of the relationship that is possible now is different from the version that was, but is not necessarily lesser. Sometimes ambiguous loss resolves not through ending, but through renegotiation, through two people choosing to know each other again from where they both actually are, rather than from where they used to be. That is not always possible, but it is sometimes, and the grief that you allow yourself to feel fully is the grief that eventually frees you to find out. Until then, you are allowed to miss them, the version of them that was, the version of yourself that existed in relationship to that version of them that was, the specific quality of being known in that specific way at that specific time. You are allowed to grieve that fully and without apology, not forever, not at the expense of the life that is happening right now, but fully and honestly, and with the acknowledgement that the loss is real, even though the world will not say so. You know that it is, and that knowing is enough to give yourself permission to mourn it. What you had was real. What you lost was real. The grief is real, and you have been holding it too quietly for too long. It is allowed to be as large as it actually is. Next episode. There is a person who is always in motion, always achieving, always building toward the next thing. And when you ask them what they enjoy, what they want when nothing is required of them, they give an answer, but even as they give it, something in them is not sure it is still true. The engine is always running, not because they love the speed, because stopping is when they would find out what is in the passenger seat, and they are afraid there is nothing there. That one is next.